Bravery is not the same as being fearless. One of the hardest parts about changing is the intangibility of it all, how abstract it is. When we want to be healthier or smarter or stronger, we want it now. But of course, for pretty much any pursuit of permanent self-change, it takes time, patience, and discipline. But it can be really hard to manage those qualities when the thing you're trying to change has a direct impact on your emotional regulation, on your social stability, on your mind. Fear can be an oppressive force. One of the hardest parts about facing your fears, with some obvious exception, is the lack of an adversary to face, other than, potentially, the self. If a fear is born of trauma connected to a personal relationship or memory, then maybe there's a face you can put the blame on, but what about for a fear of heights? Who's at fault then? Gravity? The ground? A fear of the dark or of tight spaces can't be fixed by punching or kicking. Those fears don't exist in a physical space. They can't be interacted with through force. So what do you do when you want to fight them? Exposure therapy, in the most general of terms, is a type of fear and anxiety treatment that works just how it sounds, by exposing the anxious individual in a controlled manner to their fears. For example, if you were afraid of spiders, exposure therapy would likely have you look at pictures of spiders, watch videos, have discussions about them, and slowly, over time, bring your familiarity with the arachnid race up, because, as we've discussed in other videos, fear has to do with familiarity, or lack thereof. We fear the unknown. So exposure therapy just makes our unknowns a little bit more known, in a controlled environment. In vivo, or within the living exposure therapy, is a very specific sort of step up of this idea. It works with more or less the same logic of exposing an individual to their fears, with the single difference of that interaction being direct, and in real life. So we're not looking at pictures of spiders in this case, we're interacting with real, living, moving spiders. This version of exposure therapy is more confrontational of an issue than just examining the concept abstractly, and has been proven to be effective. I think for these reasons, people who are frustrated with themselves, their fears and worries, might at one point or another gravitate to this option. It's more of a fight, it's more actionable. The struggle is made physical. And this can work with stuff like heights, or public speaking, or the dark. White-knuckling a railing on a tall building, marching step by step into an open mic night, locking yourself in a room with no lights. You're fighting your fear more actively, because with this separation of your instinct for self-preservation and your desire for self-control, you begin fighting yourself in the most productive, healthy way possible. Bravery is not the same as being fearless. Bravery is being very afraid and doing what needs to be done anyway. You need a certain amount of bravery to navigate the internet today, what with all the people out there who do whatever they want, stealing your personal information and making it publicly available for anyone to find. I used one of the many available people search sites out there to look up information about myself, and was shocked to see how much was out there. Well, not anymore thanks to the sponsor of tonight's video, Aura. I've worked with Aura a bunch of times by now, and in a time when scammers are desperate to get your personal information, you won't find a better defense. Aura can help remove your personal information from data brokers and people search sites that can sell your info to identity thieves, scammers, and more. Aura monitors your personal data, including your social security number, across billions of data points like the dark web and public court records to alert you about potential identity theft. Every adult on the account, up to 5, gets $1 million in identity theft insurance to help you cover eligible losses and fees, with a total of up to $5 million in coverage. Do you know how much that is? Those aren't the only reasons to download Aura. You also get access to a VPN, antivirus, and a password manager, all with 24/7 available support. With all those features, it's crazy that it all comes in one convenient app. Searching for your lost dog is one thing. Having strangers searching for you? Well, that's scarier than anything we're going to cover tonight. Protect yourself by going to my link to get 2 weeks for free. That's right, free. That'll be enough time for Aura to find out if any of your personal data is exposed. Thanks again to Aura for sponsoring this video. Now, let's begin our treatment. 2018's Lost in Vivo is a self-described horror game about claustrophobia. You may recognize the developer, who goes by Kira publicly, from another of their games, Spooky's Jumpscare Mansion. If you're familiar with this particular mansion, then you might have a greater appreciation for exactly the horror Kira is capable of producing, and the way they tend to utilize space as a part of that expression. On the About tab of the Kira LLC website, Kira states, I try to recreate the feel of old-school horror classics, frequently using purposely dated graphics and mechanics. I also enjoy shocking the player in unfamiliar ways and reference the horror masters, Lovecraft, Ito, and Del Toro. Fans of this channel will likely have their curiosity piqued through the referencing of these prolific horror and sci-fi artists, and Kira's claims are not just empty words. There is a clear understanding not just of the nature of horror, but the nature of fear itself, of atmosphere, of setting expectations and subverting them, of leaving things vague and up for interpretation. At the same time, though, the things you do see are uniquely horrifying and/or disgusting. But we're not there yet. Lost in Vivo opens with a dialogue. The orange text appears to belong to a therapist, and the white ellipsis is the unknown, ungendered character that we will be playing as. For the sake of this video, let's call the character Ellie, short for ellipses. Clearly, Ellie and the doctor are in the process of working through something, and that process has likely not been super effective to this point. Though it's not laid out in this scene, I think we can safely say that Ellie is suffering from claustrophobia, among other things, simply from the game's description and later setting. Ellie is notably silent during this interaction, indicating discomfort or detachment. The doctor says it might be time to try something a little bit more direct. We could start in vivo exposure therapy. From here, we move on to the first actual gameplay scene, walking down a simple, foggy street with our service dog, a corgi named Danny. As we walk, it starts raining. I love a good horror game walking intro. The walk to the baker's house in Resident Evil 7, the walk through the woods in Silent Hill 2, the first eerie walk through Sevastopol Station in Alien Isolation. The quiet, the unsureness of these scenes, where your character isn't even fully aware of the danger they'll be facing soon enough. It draws a contrast to whatever horror and intensity the majority of your playthrough will be made up of, while still usually providing clues and context for the narrative. Obviously, one of the main goals of this walking sequence, which goes on for slightly longer than one might expect, is to create a bond between you and Danny. In a horror setting, a dog's inclusion is usually a bit of an anxiety creator because horror doesn't tend to treat dogs the best. We're also given time to enjoy the beginnings of the fantastic, droning, ethereal soundtrack that is present for much of the game, inspired by the music and tone of Silent Hill, as much of this game emulates. During this walk, we encounter a missing poster for a woman named Jane, right before the storm really picks up and the weather begins to feel dangerous. It's not long after that we suddenly cut to a scene of Danny being swept away by rainwater down a drain, falling beneath the surface of the water through frantic, desperate barks. God damn it, what did I say about dogs in horror? Ellie's not letting Danny go that easily though, so she quickly locates a manhole into the sewers, and the real game begins. Your dog is missing, and you need to get her back, no matter what it takes. Fuck a wife quest. Is there any clearer or more relatable motivation than that? We're about to go all John Wick in this Vivo. I have to acknowledge something kind of right off the bat at this point, which is that I don't believe we're supposed to take the majority of the events that happen after this point, or maybe even before, literally. Let's look at it like Silent Hill 2, for instance. Just in the same way that James's experience was unique, personal, and potentially in his own head depending on who you believe or how you interpret, the following game experience might be real if you believe that there are crazy, reality-shaking creatures living in the sewers, but more realistically, it's likely a metaphor for a more grounded personal struggle. Not necessarily less horrifying in comparison, but made more universally horrifying to translate the experience to an external audience. I think we can be sure that Ellie is working through in vivo exposure therapy in reality, but that the monsters we're seeing are an expression of the intensity of this experience, not a one-to-one translation. But hey, I could also be wrong. That's what's so powerful about this type of story. The reason I wanted to clarify that is because once you approach the game from this angle of analysis, so many of the events take on a much more symbolic nature. For instance, the fact that our motivation throughout the game is to find our dog and bring it to safety could be indicating that Ellie's commitment to getting better isn't for her own sake, but rather the sake of something or someone she cares about. It's a little sad, but sometimes doing something for yourself isn't enough. You have to be concerned for the relationship you hold with or the safety of another person. Because we have no information about Ellie's backstory, and we pretty much made up her character for this essay, we can't really guess who or what Danny could be a stand-in for, but that doesn't really matter. What matters is the motivation. Anyway, we're in the sewers now. It's pretty dark in here, but luckily we have a flashlight. The environment's pretty typical for now, as far as I can tell. I don't make a point of exploring sewers that often. We can whistle for Danny down here, and thanks to the echo, wherever Danny ended up, she manages to bark her location, which really helps when deciding between directions to go at crossroads. For a claustrophobic person, being in a place like this already indicates a small bit of growth. After a certain point, it becomes clear to us that there is probably someone, or multiple someones, living down here. We find a radio playing a jaunty beat beneath this grating feedback sound, and just by that, a sledgehammer, which allows us to keep moving forward. Further down, as we continue whistling for Danny, her barks stop responding to our whistles. At a certain point, while looking down a long hallway, we whistle, and something whistles back. Who could that be? There's something really interesting about this introductory section of the game, and it's the fact that you're not really at the point of no return yet. In fact, if you turned right around at the beginning of the game and went up the ladder you just climbed down, you'd technically get an ending. It just wouldn't be a very satisfying one. But further than that, the first enemy you encounter down here, a homeless person who has taken their own eyes out for vague and concerning reasons, is definitely startling, as he jumps at you with very little warning, but it's not representative of the greater horror you're about to face. For one thing, he goes down in one hit, but further, as we approach a strange tunnel with the words, "Abandon all hope, ye who enter here," painted next to it, we start getting the impression that we haven't actually crossed the threshold of horror. For those of you who don't know, those words are a reference to Dante's Inferno, as they appear just outside the gates of hell before Dante and Virgil make their quest together. By the way, keep Virgil's name in mind as we go forward here. He'll be relevant later. We also see the name Charon carved into an oar near this entrance, another reference to the famous Greek figure depicted in Inferno. Not only is this reference indicative of a certain thematic descent into hell, but it also may signify that through perseverance, we'll find our way out, in just the way that Dante and Virgil managed to climb their way out of hell at the end of the poem. But we've not even really climbed in yet. It's a little early to be talking about climbing out. The claustrophobic angle of the game becomes a lot more apparent as we start crawling through these tunnels, horrifying sounds and rumblings from directions we cannot place adding to the tight, cramped panic building in Ellie's chest. At a certain point, we hear a snarl right next to us and glimpse what can only be described as a creature watching us with glowing red eyes before ducking away. Great. We emerge into a room filled with candles surrounding a small pit, a drop from which it is clear we will not be able to simply climb out. This is the threshold I was speaking of, the actual point of no return. The entirety of Lost in Vivo's setting, if you'll allow me to add an Ash Tree Lane element to this horror, can be viewed as a sort of character itself. This will become more clear as we pass through more zones, all stacked on top of each other in a way that makes one question the nature of the space as a whole. Mines and train stations and laboratories all jammed together in a way I don't imagine they would be naturally. Like I said, this experience likely isn't reality as we're familiar with it, just a reference to it, and through this, with its strange responses and warped halls, it feels like we've been swallowed by a monster with other monsters inside. And if we've been swallowed, this is the moment. This is the mouth. And in we plunge. Things take a turn for the cursed at this point, surprising no one. Not long after making the dive, we encounter a hall full of more candles, lit and placed by an unknown individual, and beyond their glow are terrifying Lynchian monstrosities, screaming a warped Geiger counter-esque cry and thrashing as if in pain. It appears that one of the cells has been destroyed, and that whatever was in there is no longer there. Maybe that's what we saw earlier. We have, and will receive, no truly valuable information on why these things are here, what they want, who trapped them here, and what they could mean on a more metaphorical level. And while it might be frustrating not to have these answers, that frustration and lack of clarity is potentially the point. Oftentimes, when facing our demons, we get so caught up in the why, the context of it all, the explanations for the way we're feeling, and while that might be calming, it's not necessarily productive unless specifically taken into account during treatment. In Ellie's case, the question of, what the hell are these things and why are they down here, might be interesting to consider, but crucially, it's irrelevant. As long as we can fight, avoid, or hide from whatever they are and make it to the other side, their deeper meaning doesn't really matter. Obviously, in real-world scenarios, it's probably valuable to understand the source of your pains, at least to some degree, but for these specific demons, you don't need to know their names to fight them. The section ends with us looking down a long hallway, at the end of which we can make out what appears to be a shadowy version of Danny, but as we approach to get closer, the scene changes. We're suddenly in a room, being looked down upon by a statue, gentle and relaxing music calming our beating heart as a rotating orb hovers in front of us. This is our first encounter with a save room, and brings an interesting bit of context to our game through the lens of treatment. In vivo exposure can be performed through two different methods: grading and flooding. Flooding has you face your traumas head-on with very little assistance or reprieve, kind of a total system shock. But with grading, the patient is granted moments of respite, of relaxation before continuing with their exposure, giving their emotions a moment to stabilize before spiking again with the next exposure. These save rooms indicate that Ellie's specific form of therapy falls on the grading side rather than the flooding side. You're never in any danger while in these rooms, and the calming music also lends itself to creating a comfortable space. You could stay in here as long as you'd like, but of course, having randomly been transported here with no warning, we're morbidly curious to find out what's on the other side of that door. It's a train station. Okay, that's not what I was expecting, but it's certainly not the most threatening environment in the world. As we walk quietly around the space, on edge for a jump scare that just hasn't come yet, we slowly start to realize that the station is empty. On all of the walls are various posters and artworks, one of which is a reference to Kira's other game, but most of them are centered around dieting, losing weight, looking good. A new, sickening theme begins to settle over the level, a tangible discontentment with one's own appearance, with weight and attractiveness. I'm sure I don't need to explain to you the predatory nature of these kinds of advertisements and decorations. They exist everywhere, to varying degrees, but not typically with such a blatant and disquieting presentation. In a real-world scenario, the thing that is disheartening and frustrating about empty weight loss, diet pill, reconstructive facial, whatever ads, is the empty promises they sell you that you can look exactly like whatever model or bodybuilder they've hired to act as their product's user, which is often untrue. It's a false hope, and one that can only be built by preying on the self-esteem issues of their intended audience. This, however, is unfocused, vague, and not calling attention to who you potentially could be, but rather, who you maybe are. We can't ever see ourselves in Lost in Vivo, so I can't honestly tell you if Ellie is overweight or dealing with something in a similar vein, but that doesn't actually matter. Body dysmorphia, the mental health condition that drives people to notice and become hypercritical of flaws in their appearance, isn't super discerning when it comes to making you feel bad about shit. This is the way that eating disorders can form, your brain never satisfied by how thin you are, tricking you into thinking that you have more to lose. Which you do, but it's not weight, it's your health or your life. This representation, the constant reminder of the self, is indicative, non-specifically, of another of Ellie's challenges. But we get to face it through an interesting, empathetic angle. We'll get to that in a second. At one of the train platforms, we barely miss a train pulling away, inside of which is Danny, our dog, and a figure we've never seen before, simply staring out the window as the train pulls away. This character, though I'm not certain the game ever tells you this officially, is Virgil, bringing us back to our Dante's Inferno connection. Those of you familiar with the story likely can guess what he represents, but I'll clarify real quick. In Dante's journey through the 9 layers of hell, he is shepherded by a dead Roman poet named Virgil. Virgil understands hell and God's will, and as he guides Dante, he explains each circle, the sins that led its inhabitants there, and why they're being punished in the way that they are. He's Dante's one real lifeline through the terrifying experience, a beacon of goodness in the face of all the suffering. Seeing this version of Virgil on the train with Danny, if you don't know who he is, might be upsetting, because Virgil is pretty freaky looking, and you might think he's kidnapping your dog. However, with this information in mind, it suddenly seems like Virgil might be protecting Danny, or at least in league with her, acting as another force to guide you through these warped and twisted scenes. He definitely does a lot less comforting and explaining as his namesake, but his purpose seems clear, which leads me to a theory. Virgil, this version, I mean, is probably your therapist. Observing you, keeping an eye on your service animal, forcing you to go through hardships so that you might come out the other end stronger. I mean, in the face of this all being metaphorical or dream logic, it still makes sense that there'd have to be a governing force, a person or entity who actually cultivates the experience for you. How else would the exposure therapy work, considering it from this enclosed environment? This could be a reach, but it's a possibility that makes things so much more interesting for me, so let me know what you think. We also find our first tape player in the station. When we opened the game, we already had a tape in our inventory labeled The Pound. We'll find other lost tapes during our playthrough, however, this is apparently the only one that is canonical according to the wiki. The contents of this tape includes us, playing as Ellie, as we walk through a hellish version of a dog pound. We're bombarded by the sounds of barking dogs who seem to be in varying levels of distress, and when we draw too close to certain enclosures, nightmarish and violent maws lash out at us from the darkness. This is, as far as I can tell, Ellie's memory of getting Danny, who we find curled up at the end of the level. Clearly, in Ellie's mind, this was an intense and harrowing experience, filled with loud noises and haunting images. However, as the tape ends with us carrying Danny out of the pound, we already know that Ellie has the capacity to face intense situations, specifically when it has to do with helping someone or something she cares about. Ellie is braver than she likely gives herself credit for, but her bravery is usually saved for someone else's benefit. This entire in vivo exposure process is trying to pull that inherent, hidden bravery out of her. We catch the next train and start to follow Virgil and Danny's path. We've also started finding notes from a currently unknown author who seems to be struggling with appearance issues, adding to the violently body-focused theme of this environment. Interestingly though, as some other analysts of this game tend to miss, no shade, these notes are not written by Ellie. I mean, she discovers them, how could they be? What's fascinating here is that if we're to believe that Ellie is indeed suffering from body issues, it appears that she's interfacing with those issues secondhand, as she learns of the sufferings of another person. I truly can't speak to whether or not this is accurate in a real-world scenario, but it seems here that by calling attention to the familiar struggles of another, Ellie is being prepped to deal with her own issues. As the train moves forward, we hear a scream, then a series of thuds as our train passes over a heavy mass, then screeches to a halt. It appears, at least audibly, that someone has jumped in front of our train. This is backed up when, upon leaving the vehicle, we discover a pair of shoes stood just by the train tracks, a symbol, typically in Asian cultures, of preparing to take one's own life. But who did it? Unsurprisingly, we quickly realize that it's the person who's been leaving the notes around, as we begin working our way through the station to restore power to the train and continue chasing our dog. This person, a young woman it seems, was clearly struggling with body issues, thinking themselves unattractive, wanting to hide away from others in the darkness so they could not see her face. At a certain point, she got a boyfriend, one who was initially supportive to at least some degree, but who began commenting on her weight and appearance, asking her to change. She wanted to, but every time she looked in the mirror, she didn't notice any difference, despite her efforts. Whether or not this is a result of that aforementioned body dysmorphia, we don't know, but we do know that at a certain point, she became pregnant, and that's where things started to get really bad. You remember that missing poster we saw while walking Danny at the very start of the game, for the woman named Jane? Well, this was Jane. It's interesting that she's apparently only missing, not known as dead. Maybe it's meant to represent how she couldn't even recognize her true self in the end, that Jane was missing, and all that was left was the ugly, overweight, pregnant, and betrayed version of herself that only she and the terrible people around her could see, that caused her to do what she did. Jane is still here in the station, but it's not really Jane anymore. Following us through walls and down hallways every time we reset a fuse box and are cast back into the dark is Jane's specter, warped, horrible, and angry. She doesn't like the light, which is why she only comes once you're in the dark, still desperate not to be seen for the horror that she is. Until, eventually, the whole of the station has been reset, and with nowhere left to flee, Jane's twisted form is destroyed. Hopefully, this will be something of a relief to her. Hopefully, she can move on. We can't quite yet, though. Just because we helped somebody else, if you want to call it helping, doesn't mean that we're suddenly over our own problems. We're able to board a new train and continue on to a new section of the station called Grand Bulim Avenue. The name of this game's section is pretty clearly a reference to the eating disorder bulimia. Just another quick warning, I'm going to talk about bulimia for a second. Bulimia manifests as a cycle of binging and purging, of eating a lot of food all at once without control, then forcing oneself to throw up out of shame or guilt or fear. It's often a repeated process, and it can have dangerous and lasting effects on the body and mind. The exact cause of bulimia is not known. It could have something to do with genes, but in many cases it tends to be based at least somewhat around societal pressure. We can't be certain whether or not Jane suffered from this specific condition, but the pressure from her partner to become more thin could have very possibly become a catalyst for it, or something similar. In the case of Granbulum Station, though, the indication seems to point more towards our character, who again I have taken to calling Ellie, but is a character of non-specific gender. A clarification I make because bulimia also affects men, though the majority of recorded cases are in women. The reason I believe Ellie is the one suffering from bulimia in this instance is, 1, the game is, at its core, about her experiences, and though we've had reference to Jane's struggle, Jane's storyline was more or less wrapped up with her banishing at the end of the last area, and 2, some of the encounters we'll have in this area. Let's talk about it. There's this really strange moment that pops up in this area. While trying to move forward, we encounter a door covered in weird goop that apparently means we can't get through. Lucky for us, there's a container of incredibly dangerous acid nearby, and we pick it up and carry it over to use on the door. Unfortunately, we slip on a puddle and spill the acid all over ourselves and die horribly. Now, when this happened, I simply thought, oh, okay, let's try that again, but this time, let's avoid the puddle. That must have been my mistake. However, when I left the save room, which was conveniently located nearby, and headed back to the room I died in, I found it filled with these creepy floating mirror enemies. That's different. If you can't tell from the footage, there's the image of a woman in these mirror enemies, being reflected back at you. This could indicate that we are indeed playing a woman, but could also just be a further reference to the running theme of body dysmorphia. There's also a new pile of fleshy goop on the floor, in just about the exact spot that we died. Weird. When you interact with it, the first words that pop up are gross and disgusting, but continuing to interact with it changes the words to I'm gross, I'm disgusting, no one wants me. This scene is really interesting and could mean a couple different things. For one thing, it seems pretty clear that yes, that puddle of gore is you, somehow, from your last life or save. I'm glad we're calling this experience a metaphor because otherwise I would not be certain how to classify this event. It could, in one way or another, indicate that you're in less danger than it seems, that you're not actually at risk, and that something, possibly the therapist or Virgil, if they're not the same person, is protecting you. It could also simply be a horror game attempting to make you feel a little off, to put you more completely in the shoes of the protagonist. One thing's for sure, it definitely backs up the idea that Ellie has self-esteem issues. Though it's true that her melted body here is disgusting, the phrasing of her sentiments and the additional words of "no one wants me" speaks more to how she feels about herself than this strange gore iteration we see on the floor before us. But hey, the door doesn't have slime on it anymore, somehow, so we get to move on. Things are normal down here. We're introduced to a new type of enemy, which is a train! We fight trains down here. We do some exploring, some puzzle solving, some more train fighting, tunneling, until finally we start encountering these little leech things. Gross. They're all gathered around a gate that we try to lockpick but fail, so we move on to a save room. The light's not usually red above save rooms. Did that just say save erased? When we go back to the room, there's suddenly a massive monster in there, who Ellie does her best to fight against, but it's no use. This monster, which the game calls Shoggoth, is a reference to a monster in the Lovecraft mythos, as well as the name of a pet snowflake eel that was owned by the developer who passed away. It's horrifying and heartwarming. The game tries to fake us out, making us believe that we actually have lost our save data by cutting back to a scene very similar to our original opening conversation with the therapist, but this time, we're actually hearing a conversation between Jane and her therapist. Do we have the same therapist? Maybe. I don't think there's enough evidence to confirm or deny. This conversation is different than ours. For one thing, Jane actually responds to what the therapist says. Their conversation is about exactly what we've been discussing, body dysmorphia. Jane says she feels like everyone hates her, and she hates herself. Her doctor responds that she has worth, she has beauty, but she's unable to see it. Her vision of herself is distorted. Jane asks how to fix her vision of herself if she can't fix her body. It's a hard conversation just to read. From a few pieces of dialogue, we're helped to understand just how painful and hopeless these experiences can feel to the people facing them. The doctor says they'll refill Jane's prescription for fluoxetine, which you might know better as Prozac, which is an antidepressant that, in some cases, can cause suicidal thoughts. This, among other things, could have contributed to Jane doing what she did. When we return to the game after this scene, we're in a new space. In front of us are two doorways, one of which has a painting of a warped and unsettling face next to it, the other of which has a picture of an idealized and somewhat cartoonish woman next to it. The choice is yours to make which doorway you go through. Both doorways end up looping back to the room you start in. No matter how many times you go through the doorway on the right, with the blonde woman, nothing changes, other than the fact that you have to deal with more enemies. If you keep insisting on following that path, eventually you encounter another Shoggoth who once again kills you. When you go through the warped door, however, you're rewarded with items and ammunition, and the room changes when you return. The warped picture begins to resemble an actual person more and more, whereas the cartoon woman fragments and becomes a collection of disjointed shapes and colors. Eventually, if you keep following the path on the left, the warped picture becomes a full black and white photo of a woman, and you're able to continue. The messaging of this scene is fairly clear, in my opinion. Through repetitive trial and error, Ellie is forced to recognize that striving for an unattainable and unrealistic image just produces more problems, and that by facing the reality of her appearance, which at first she finds deeply unsettling, she'll be able to find a much more comfortable peace with herself, until eventually that image that was so disgusting and horrifying to her simply isn't anymore. Ellie's making progress. It hurts, and it's a lot, but she's doing it. There's still a lot more to face, though. In our next room, we encounter an apple and an empty doorway, and very quickly find ourselves returning to these themes of bulimia we've been discussing. To continue forward, we're required to eat the apple. However, doing so raises bars over the door that we need to get through. The bars only lower when you throw up the contents of your stomach into a nearby toilet. However, if you just proceed through the bars on the door, they don't stop you. The only way for Ellie to move forward is to eat regularly and to avoid purging. As we continue forward from this room, we encounter, strangely, a warped, Lynchian baby crying by itself on a changing station surrounded by dead rats. Is this Jane's baby? All things considered, it seems likely that Jane's life ended while she was pregnant, so what could this represent? Possibly a horrifying empathy to Jane's situation? Possibly a representation of the people hurt by another's suffering and pressure? Alternatively, we find a note from Jane that informs us that after a certain point, Jane began to feel like the baby was a parasite and that she wanted to get rid of it. Maybe this could be a reference to that fact, whether or not she followed through on this desire. Whatever the case, we get one last encounter with Jane, as we finally move on from this subway setting. Walking down the tracks, trying to reach a faraway exit, we suddenly encounter the rapidly growing sounds and sights of a train fast approaching. With nowhere to turn, Ellie is about to face the same fate as Jane, however, intervention. A new ghostly figure stops the train from colliding with us. The spirit is not horrible and twisted, but instead human in appearance and gentle. Looks like we got our wish from earlier. Jane is at peace, and she saves us from the same trauma that she endured. Or maybe we saved ourselves. The tracks fall away a little down the line, and we follow the tunnel that formed beneath them. Again, it's the layout of this area, the way different levels are attached to each other, stacked on top of each other like the circles of hell, that makes this place seem so impossible. We discover a mine beneath the train station, where we'll spend our next little bit of time. Our objective here has mostly to do with finding 3 missing pieces to act as keys for a locked door near the mouth of the cave. As per video game standards, they're scattered around the map, and as we search for them, we find our dog. Huh. Kinda strange finding you down here. What's wrong with you? Oh, gee! So, there's a dog mimic down here. I was joking when I called it that in the last sentence, but that's genuinely what the enemy is called according to the wiki. Great minds, me and Kira. Anyway, this dog mimic is a cool enemy. For one thing, when you deal enough damage to it, you don't kill it. It just slinks back out of view for a while, waiting to find another position to pounce on you from. Interestingly, the enemy seems rather sensitive to sound, specifically the sound of your whistle. Did you forget we could do that? This enemy, from a pure design standpoint, is one of my favorites in the game, not simply because it hides visually as a dog, but because its other functions are clearly built around the idea of hunting through familiarity. If you encountered this thing hiding in the real world, especially if you were looking for your own lost dog, it could lead you away from a group and manipulate you into consistently giving away your exact location as you whistle and call for it. We can read this enemy as representing any number of things. Ellie's fear of losing her dog, the fear of being betrayed by someone close to you, the fear of making the wrong choice, subtle shameless video plug, It's not expressly clear from the enemy's design, but it could also just be that certain levels carry more emotional weight than others, and that this is just a cool enemy to fill a cramped space that, admittedly, induces more claustrophobia than the previous level we fought through. There's this moment near the end of the level where you're climbing a ladder away from the dog mimic, and you think, surely this dog mimic can't climb ladders, but surprise! This dog mimic can climb ladders, and you have a tense sequence where you're climbing away from it while it scampers after you, barely on your heels. When you reach the top of the ladder, though, it's gone. There is this weird figure standing here, though, but it disappears as soon as we really notice it. Weird. But finally, we have all the items needed to move forward. What's behind this door? Another mine shaft? A hidden temple? A laboratory? That's rather unexpected, but hey, at this point, most things in the game are. This level is called Nezumi Testing, but as you walk past the sign informing you of this, you might notice that the underlined letters actually spell out nesting. That's ominous. What's nesting here? Well, as we quickly discover, rats. A lot of rats. It appears that whatever work was being done here had to do primarily with experimenting on these little creatures, and the results of those experiments were not good. In these levels, we encounter enemies called rat men, and if their design seems familiar to you, it's because they're based on a famous painting by the Polish surrealist Zdzisław Beksinski. Here we go. Time to look this up. Zdzisław Beksinski, whose name I really hope I'm pronouncing correctly. An interesting piece of trivia about the painter. He's quoted as saying, when asked about his work, that he wanted to paint in such a manner as if he were photographing dreams. This could explain why Kira chose to reference his work in this game, with its surreal and dreamlike presentation. Based on the artist Kira referenced by name on their website, it makes sense that they'd gravitate to the work and themes of Beksinski. The name Satirus starts popping up in notes left by a character named Dr. Piccinini, whose body you can find being devoured by rats in one of the laboratory rooms. It's spoken about vaguely, but Piccinini seems to hold it in very high regard, calling it his savior, which is the English translation of Satirus from Greek. That is, until later notes where he seems appropriately afraid of it, just like everyone else who speaks about the thing. We haven't encountered it yet, as far as we know, but we can be pretty confident it's coming. In the meantime, though, Ellie has got to get out of this lab. We turn a corner and find Danny? Like, for real, it's actually Danny, and she seems happy to see us. How did she get down here? Why was she in this place? It doesn't really matter, though, because as far as I'm concerned, we've beaten the game. Come on, Danny, let's walk through this. Yeah, I should have seen this coming. Danny is washed away even deeper into the hellhole we've been trekking through, and at this point, what did I expect? An easy way out? This experience has never been about easy ways out. Oh well, onwards. We reach a shipping area, and once there... Hang on. What's this statue thing doing here? It kind of resembles that figure we saw climbing out of the mine away from the dog mimic, but how could it be here? Is it possible that something scary is happening in my horror game? Let me just get close to it and investigate. Well, again, I should have seen this coming. This is Satirus, the thing from the thing, you know? Spoiler alert, he's essentially a weeping angel, or SCP-173, depending on what kind of nerd you are. He moves when you're not looking, and if you give him the opportunity, he's gonna break your neck. If you're curious about Satirus' lore, then allow me to inform you by reading directly from the wiki. Satirus was a witch king who ruled a starving kingdom during the first age of magic. He would force his subjects to eat rats and was eventually betrayed by his own knights. Banished to the old well, his arm was cut off so he may never crawl out, and his eyes were gouged out so he may never look up. He endlessly starved in the well and only had rats for nourishment, yet he never died. Using the last of his magic, he turned himself to stone, and legends say that in the deepest pits of the well, you can still see a crumbling statue of him, worshipped by the rats. So, yeah, hopefully that answers whatever questions you had, because personally, I have no idea if and how this is relevant to the rest of the game, other than explaining why there's so many rats around, and why they eat your eyes if Satirus kills you. I'm not sure if Satirus represents anything specific, perhaps the fear of being followed or observed, like in hit podcast The Magnus Archives, but it also seems like the figure could be a reference to a character in another of Kira's game, Lunacid, specifically the Wretched King of Rats. I haven't played Lunacid yet, so I'll get back to you on that. Anyway, to get out of here, we have to use a retinal scanner, but unfortunately, we don't have the right eyes for it. The required set belongs to Dr. Piccinini, but we already know what happened to him. The eyes have to be around here somewhere, though, so we search around for them, all the while being stalked by Satyris, who we often find in new locations and strange poses. The layout of this area does not work in our favor. The way packages are organized, it's nearly impossible to keep Satyris in your line of vision while effectively navigating. And even when you can, you have to search through multiple rooms to find what you're looking for, so he gets plenty of opportunities to get to you. Eventually, we do manage to find an eye, and we pick it up, but so does Satyris, inserting it into his own eye socket, which, you'll remember, was originally gouged out when he was thrown into the well. This doesn't change his behavior in any significant way. However, anytime Ellie encounters him now, he's staring at her. We make our way to the retinal scanner, open the door, and find an elevator waiting for us. It starts heading upwards and... Wait, did we beat the game? Why are credits rolling? We still don't have Danny. By this point, we already know that the game likes trying to fake us out, so we linger and wait to see if anything happens, which it does. Eventually, the credits start getting a little odd. Apparently, I was responsible for the motion capture in the game. I didn't know that. I feel like someone should have told me. The game also says that the blood in the game was from one of the people on my Steam friends list. I don't think that's true either. Eventually, it becomes clear that we're actually being interacted with by Satyris, and that the game's not over. If we look to the side of the elevator as it begins heading back down, we can see Satyris clutching the bars and staring at us, desperate for our eyes. But he doesn't get them. I like to think, once again adding my own ridiculous interpretation to this minor scene, that by this point in the experience, the game already knows you're going to make it out, so it expects you to be vaguely disappointed by this easy answer. But of course, in the case of facing one's fears, easy answers are rarely the correct ones. And so, as we realize we'll have to face more horrors and hardships, it's almost a relief. I mean, we've come this far. We can take whatever's left. We aren't desperate for simply escape anymore. We're ready to fight for our good ending. The next stage, though it's not technically the final stage we'll encounter, seems like the culmination of this fight. I'm not even sure how to explicitly classify the next stage we enter. It doesn't resemble any familiar space in the way that many of the other areas have, leading me to believe that we're approaching a sort of climax at this point, both in metaphor and gameplay. The area is called the Siren's Lair in the wiki, which makes sense considering what we encounter here, that being one of my favorite horror game antagonists I've ever seen. We're forced to move through each of the 3 separate sections in specific order, trying to find generators for something. The note we're following is one from an older level, but it must still refer to the process we're expected to take to move forward, however that happens. In each of the 3 areas we pass through to make our escape, we encounter short children's stories that seemingly have nothing to do with our time down here, but upon closer inspection, you notice a pattern. These notes are teaching you how to defeat something. Like the notes with Satyris, we haven't encountered it yet, but we know it's coming soon. In each of these rooms, we encounter a non-physically hostile entity that the game classifies as your brain, which hurls nasty insults and musings of doubt your way in a man's voice as you approach it. It says you're pathetic and worthless, that you need fear to motivate you. It mocks your attempts to fix yourself. It claims you used to cling to it like a parasite. Not only are these creatures clearly manifestations of your self-doubts and self-hate, but they also mimic the verbiage that an abuser would use, indicating that Ellie has encountered similar hardships to Jane with her relationships. Luckily, we have a pretty effective system of relief here. We kill these shit-talking brains. Doing so the first time triggers a cutscene where a figure that looks like Virgil summons an entity from a spot below us. Huh. That certainly doesn't feel like the actions of a benevolent character, but as I mentioned, we don't get out of this situation without hardship, so again, this is just Virgil, or the therapist, forcing us to confront something difficult in the hopes that it will turn out positively. Alright, what is it this time? Oh! Jesus! Fuck! Oh shit! What the fuck is that? Oh, what is that? Whoa! That's the siren, you know, from the lair. Yeah, he's pretty terrifying. A character that follows you around nonstop has a certain way of freaking out an unfamiliar horror player, and this isn't just a weird big guy like Mr. X, this is a titan-sized smiling abomination who emanates the sound of hell as it moves around you. I've loved this enemy. You're able to stop the siren in each of its stages through various means conveyed to you through the children's stories, like electrocution. However, you can't actually kill it until the final stage, where it traps you with it and forces you into a boss fight. It's not easy too. You have to perfectly time a door falling on the monster, usually multiple times, so you can deal enough damage to it without it simply destroying you. Once it's dead though, we finally get to move on. And this time, I kind of mean it. Like I said, there is one more stage to get through, but it doesn't add much more to the game. Honestly, it feels like climbing to the surface. You navigate some tunnels, kill these final groups of enemies that come at you, these weird spitting guys, and finally, you reach a ladder out of this place. As you exit the nightmare, daylight streams from above, the blue sky more calming and inviting than it's ever been, and Danny's there, waiting for you. I almost expected a fake out here because 1, the game has programmed me to, and 2, it doesn't make sense that Danny would already be outside, especially after watching her get swept away deep underground so many times, but I think there's an answer here. Danny is the one we've had to convince ourselves that we were doing all this for, facing our fears and all that. We probably wouldn't have dived into that sewer if there were another way. However, because we felt like our fight was for someone else, that powered us through. Of course, it wasn't about Danny, not really. Danny was just a guide, quite like Virgil, explaining why they were seen together on the train. A reason to get better. And honestly, we have by this point. We faced body issues, abuse, pain, and paranoia. And of course, as the game puts a focus on, claustrophobia. As a player, things that were once intimidating, loud, and hidden at the beginning of the game just aren't anymore. They're simply obstacles we now know we can overcome. Ellie might not be completely over her fears, as it's something that requires consistent work and care to truly overcome, but the steps she's taken today will pave the way towards a better life for her, whatever that means, and it's one she gets to share with her dog, who, no matter how you read the experience, she clearly cares about. We've made it through hell. And that's Lost in Vivo. Now, I know that there are a ton of things I didn't cover in this video. Secrets, game modes, and alternate endings that add even more to the gaming experience. Hell, I know that after I beat the game, I got access to a new game plus that I'll be super excited to get into. If you liked this video and want to see me cover the extra stuff, let me know. Like any good YouTuber, I'm happy to make a follow-up if this video does well. But the reason I talked about the game in this way and with this ending is because 1, it's the most complete experience of the game you're likely going to get, and 2, because I think this version of the playthrough sends the best, most honest message. I talked about a lot of serious things tonight, and I hope that I did so in a way that was respectful and informative. I've been lucky enough to avoid many of the issues and fears that Ellie faces specifically, but have also been unlucky, or let's just call it human, enough to have encountered others. If I talked about something you're struggling with, I hope I made it clear that I was rooting for you, because I am. You don't need to know someone to understand their hardship. We don't know Ellie. Hell, that's not even really her name. We don't even know if she's a her, but we care about her by the end of the game nonetheless. We even care about her a little bit by the beginning, the very relatable John Wick questline drawing us into her state of mind before we even know what's really happening. The point is, a story like this is universal, and a valuable tool not just for understanding ourselves and our fears, but our empathy as well. Why do you think the game puts such a heavy focus on Jane, a character we have no real connection to? It's because we don't need that connection to want to help her, to feel grief at her death, to be relieved when she rescues us later. I talk in a lot of my essays about how scary other people can be, how hard it is to trust the opinions and motives of others, but sometimes, in deeply horrifying situations, we find our humanity is the strongest. This game explores the nature of living with fear in a way that is confrontational but sincere in just the perfect way to complement its own message and narrative. So I leave you with this. If you're afraid right now, you shouldn't be ashamed. It's a natural response to hardship, and a lot of things are hard right now. You don't need to hate yourself for struggling or being unsure, because bravery is not the same as being fearless. Bravery is fighting for the things you care about, no matter the odds. Bravery is looking at an uncertain situation and diving in. Bravery is going through hell and then climbing back out. So start climbing. If you made it to the end of this video, thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it. I realized that I have not been shouting out my members at the end of my videos, so I figured let's start doing that process now. Thank you so much to Opia, Chandler Schaefer, Sir Rabbitkins, Canaron, Nilesh Gupta, Kai, Unusual, Erd249, Logan Jerlin, Ohime, Plasma User, and Squiddy. I really appreciate all of you guys, and if you want to be shouted out in one of my videos, all you have to do is become a member. You also get access to our cool Discord and some videos a couple days ahead of time, depending on my schedule. That's all for tonight. I really appreciate you guys, and I'll see you in the next one. See you later, Boneheads.